Good morning, and welcome to the future of U.S. national security. I'm Paula Dobriansky. I'm Vice Chair of the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, and also an Atlantic Council Board Director. We are very pleased that you could join us today for the latest installment of our Elections 2020 series, as well as the Scowcroft Center's longstanding Commander Series in partnership with Saab USA. The legacy of our late namesake, former National Security Advisor General Brent Scowcroft, guides the mission of the Scowcroft Center to develop sustainable, nonpartisan strategies and to address the most important security challenges, not only those that we face today, but those of the future. The United States cannot afford solely to tackle today and tomorrow's threats. Instead, policymakers must look beyond the horizon to develop comprehensive national strategies to best position our country and working closely with our allies and friends for sustained long-term success. This approach was truly emblematic of General Scowcroft's brilliant thinking. To address the most crucial foreign policy and security challenges in this election year and beyond, the Council has launched a series of events focused on America's role in the world. Today, the Scowcroft Center and its Forward Defense Practice area have convened a panel of distinguished former national security advisors for a strategic, nonpartisan conversation on key security threats and priorities for the next presidential administration, be it Democratic or Republican. We hope to forge a path forward for the United States as it enters a particularly complex security and defense environment over the next 2 decades. Alongside the Atlantic Council's Executive Chairman Emeritus, General James Jones, Ambassador John Bolton, and Mr. Robert McFarland will all be on the panel together. All of them have served as assistants to the President for National Security Affairs, more commonly referred to as National Security Advisors. We will hear their insights about harnessing national power and building interagency consensus to combat the most complicated security challenges of our time. The panel will be moderated by Vivian Salama, National Security Correspondent at CNN. But before we begin the panel discussion, I would like to turn it over to my fellow Atlantic Council Board Director, Michael Anderson. Michael is the head of the Strategic Partnerships and International Affairs at Saab USA and has been an invaluable partner in advancing timely debates on crucial strategic issues here at the Scowcroft Center. Michael, we truly thank you for your 11-year partnership on our flagship Commander Series. You have been great. We look forward to many more events like these in the years to come. But before I turn it over to Michael, let me just take a moment. I want to remind everyone that this event is public and on the record. And in fact, it is also being aired on C-SPAN. So please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And our moderator, Vivian Salama, will choose from among them during the Q&A session. So once again, I'd like to thank all of you for being with us for the future of U.S. national security. Over to you, Michael, and thank you.
Thank you, Paula. It's terrific to be here. I'm Mike Anderson at Saab. On behalf of Saab, we're very thrilled to be partnering with the Atlantic Council on the Commander Series. This is the 6th Commander Series event we've hosted this year, and I must say, I'm particularly excited about this one. The Commander Series is the Atlantic Council's flagship speakers forum for senior military and defense leaders. Over the past 11 years, we have jointly provided a platform to discuss current strategic issues with an impressive audience drawn from across Washington's policy community, including think tanks, media, industry, embassies, and the US government. This year alone, we have hosted the Chief of Staff of the Army and the Commanding General of the Army Futures Command, the Commander of Transportation Command, the Chief of the National Guard Bureau, and most recently, we hosted the Secretary of the Air Force and the Air Force leadership, who together unveiled the Air Force first Arctic strategy. But what an exciting panel of luminaries we have gathered here today. I'm very much looking forward to this discussion on the future of U.S. national security and to hearing what General Jones, Mr. McFarlane, and Ambassador Bolton have to say about the future challenges that they see looming on the horizon for the United States and its allies, and how we need to be prepared. Between them, our panelists have a combined 60 years of military experience. Collectively, they have led key U.S. national security decisions during times of crisis, spanning significant periods from the Cold War, the War on Terror, to the rise of great power competition with China and Russia. As we look to understand what the next few years and decades will mean for U.S. national security, there is no shortage of experience and wisdom to be shared from our esteemed guests. I'm also very delighted to introduce our moderator for today's event, Ms. Vivian Salaman, who is national security correspondent for CNN. Throughout her career, she has covered U.S. foreign policy and national security from more than 70 countries. Thank you so much for moderating the conversation today. Over to you, Vivian.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Paula. It's such an honor to be here, and of course, with this very, very impressive panel. I'm really honored to lead this conversation today. These gentlemen do not need an introduction, but for good measure, I'll just run through the very, very top lines of their bios. General James Jones is Executive Chairman Emeritus at the Atlantic Council. He served under President Barack Obama as the nation's 22nd National Security Advisor, beginning in January 2009. Previously, he had served as Supreme Allied Commander Europe and as the 32nd Commandant of the Marine Corps. So it's great to have you, General Jones. The Honorable Robert, or Bud McFarlane, is the co-founder and director of IP3 International, a nuclear technology company. He served as the 13th National Security Advisor under President Ronald Reagan, and is a retired Marine Corps officer. But it's great to have you here too. And of course, Ambassador John Bolton chairs the Foundation for American Security and Freedom, serving most recently as the 27th National Security Advisor under President Donald Trump. And Ambassador Bolton previously served as U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations under President George W. Bush and other government posts as well. So gentlemen, it's so great to have the three of you here today. A few bits of housekeeping notes. Folks, it is not ideal that we're doing this on Zoom. We wish we could be together, but in the meantime, we do want to keep this as interactive as possible. So you'll see the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen for Zoom. Click on it, send your questions. We definitely want to hear from you. Don't forget to put your name and affiliation so we know who we're talking to. We want to make this a conversation. So definitely get your questions in early. Also, we encourage our audience to join the discussion on Twitter using hashtags AC Elections 2020 and Forward Defense. Again, AC Elections 2020 and Forward Defense. Okay, so let's get cracking. There's lots to talk about with these gentlemen. And since we're being hosted by the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, I thought, we would talk about the model that was kind of developed by the late great General Brett Scowcroft. He inspired a model for staffing and process and efficiency at the National Security Council, one in which many of his successors have referred to as the ultimate goal for running the NSC. And so from each of you, it would be great to hear what your thoughts are about the current National Security Council structure and or the role of the National Security Council. I already see Ambassador Bolton laughing a little bit with the question. And how can processes and procedures improve policymakers' approach to national security issues? And so maybe General Jones, we can start with you. General, I believe you're on mute, sir.
Okay.
Okay, there we go. I hear you.
Okay.
Go for it.
Well, thank you very much. I probably should start out by quoting Daniel Webster, who President Eisenhower used to like to quote And one of his favorite quotes was, "America is great because it is good. If America ever ceases to be good, America will cease to be great." And and I think that that's something that we should keep in mind as we lurch back and forth in this 21st century, which is incredibly complex and very, very different from the 20th century. Um, the very concept of national security and everything that it entails is much broader. It's all happening at a much more rapid pace than ever before. I think since I left the White House in 2010, and I'm sure John would agree with this, that the pace of things every single day is almost doubled, if not tripled. And so we're living in a very difficult time where our ability to deal with the 24-hour news cycle, the advances in technology, and the never-ending demand for rapid answers to complex questions never seems to go away. So I think that that characteristic has a great deal to do with the effectiveness of the National Security Council, which, in my view, is um, should be as strategic as possible, and should serve as a coordinating mechanism across the interagency to highlight for the president those things that he or she um, absolutely has to know in real time. So this is a complex time, demands just an awful lot of work, great people at every station, and an ability to deal with the ever increasing speed of things happening around the world.
Mr. McFarland, the world was a different place when Brett Scowcroft had this vision for the NSC. Having served somewhat around the same time as he did at the NSC, why do you think he kind of saw the NSC as needing to fit under a certain model, and do you think it was the right model?
Well, I've spent a lot of time with General Scowcroft before I accepted the job, and even during the job, I consulted with him on a regular basis. Um, One of the big differences between the Bush administration and with Steve Hadley and the Obama administration was that we decided immediately to combine both the Homeland Security Council and the National Security Council into one organization. It became a little heavy in terms of people, but at least for the way President Obama liked to make decisions, it worked better. It worked better for him. I'm not saying it's the only way, but one of the things that General Scowcroft impressed on me at the outset is that every president gets to shape the National Security Council the way he or she wants to shape it. And it's probably the one institution in our government that has to be ready to go as soon as the inauguration ceremony is over with. Right. And so that combination of Homeland Security and national security goes back and forth depending on the administration. I think John and I were in agreement that combining both is a good idea, but it's, as I said, it's not the only way. It has to be shaped for how the president likes to make decisions and how he wants to see the National Security Council in the overall context of the government.
Well, Ambassador Bolton, you had a strong response when I asked the question. Why don't you share your thoughts?
Well, I agree with a lot of what Jim has said. I have in my book, I quote a paragraph from John Sununu's memoir of his days as chief of staff in the Bush 41 White House, where he said when the president was in town at 8 a.m. every morning, there'd be the intelligence briefing followed by for about 15 minutes, followed by about a half an hour of Brent Scowcroft talking about national security. Sometimes that went on for a while, and then Brent would stay on when Governor Sununu would discuss with President Bush the pressing domestic and political issues. And as I said in the book, if that were the way things went in the Trump White House, I would have felt like I had died and gone to heaven. It is absolutely correct that every National Security Council structure has to adopt to the president who's leading the country. That's the council's purpose. The reasoning behind its creation and functioning is to advise the president. That it has no independent purpose other than that. But in a time when many issues come before the president that involve national security, when the interagency process has become cumbersome and bureaucratic, the effectiveness of the NSC to advise the president, I think, is critical. And there are many different theories as to how it can work, but I think if you abandon it, it would be a huge mistake. And I think part of the problem, I know we're not supposed to be too topical here, but part of the problem that we face today is that it just doesn't suit the current incumbent. And we'll see what happens in the next administration, whoever it might be.
Mr. McFarland, what was the vision originally? I mean, when you served, now we're getting 35 years ago or so. What was the world kind of demanding this certain model, or do you think that it was something that Brett Scowcroft felt was something that would enhance our ability to tackle national security threats in the future?
Well, Vivian, I think Jim Jones is right that each president will design, manage, oversee the council the way he or she wants it. The model really stems back to Henry Kissinger in the mid-70s. And as his deputy, Brett adopted it. I was working for Brett at the time, became kind of the chief of staff. But I think I would only add to what John and Jim have said, that the council is to enable formation of policies designed to accomplish the goal the president has set. And so if we're looking to build U.S. foreign policy toward the Middle East, the National Security Advisor publishes a directive saying the president wants to know how does he accomplish the following goal in the Middle East. Give me political, economic, and military dimensions of how he or she ought to do that. And about 6 weeks later, a paper comes back. And since Kissinger, Scowcroft, and the three of us, that is, broadly speaking, been the way it has run. And the point I stress in that approach is this, that today it has become the fashion to publish one paper, which is the national strategy. And in the old days, there was probably a dozen papers to start with on a more differentiated set of policy issues, U.S. policy toward allies, U.S. policy toward the Middle East, toward China, toward Russia. And that way, by speeches targeted on each one of these, you got a public elaboration from the president or the security advisor or secretary of state about the nitty gritty of what our policy is in each of these domains. Well, I thought that led a certain order to the relationship building around the world in writing and in oral discourse. The staff has always been too big. It was about mid-50s under Kissinger and Scowcroft. I think I had a tops of about 58, but you don't need 400. I think John would agree. And the beginning of wisdom is to have a staff that doesn't portray itself in numbers or hubris, that it is running things. It is to manage a system that can enable the president to make sensible decisions, and a staff of 400 is far too many to do that.
I agree. I agree with what you just said, but one of the things that I found upon my arrival as a National Security Advisor was that the National Security Council was severely underfunded and severely overpopulated. But one of the problems that manifested itself is that fully 2/3 to 3/4 of the staff on the National Security Council were from the interagency, from the Defense Department, from the State Department, from all over the government, on loan to the National Security Council, and therefore paid for by their parent organizations. And what happened was that this loan was temporary. It was either 1 or 2 years, not much more than that. And what we found is after 1 year, about half the National Security Council staff, professional staff, rotated, and new people came in. And I thought that was wholly unsatisfactory, and argued for more funding and basically an ability to make the National Security Council sort of a mini agency with the budgets for the type of work that the National Security Council needed to do, which we did not have. So yes, I think 400 is way too many, but I think more importantly, it would be great to have a National Security Council that would have a smaller staff, but a dedicated professional staff that would be there for the long haul instead of losing 50% every year.
Let me throw out another question. I'm going to start with you, Ambassador Bolton, as I think you probably have some strong thoughts on this. In covering the NSC closely, I've discovered that different national security advisors have different views on sort of where the role is for foreign, international versus domestic, what the portfolio should be for the national security advisor. And in particular, and I've even spoken with President Trump's current national security advisor, Robert O'Brien, about this very issue, where it says, in cases like the pandemic that we're currently dealing with, where do the responsibilities of the national security advisor ideally fall when you have a very large domestic component in addition to the international? Ambassador Bolton?
Well, I think in part it depends on how effective the coordination mechanisms are on the domestic policy side. And again, each president has his or her own vision of that. My own view is that not enough decision making on the domestic side takes into account the international aspects. And there are some questions that obviously affect both, like trade, for example, or like the handling of the pandemic. But I think just as it's evolved historically, as Bud said, going back to Henry Kissinger, the current one, but really, I think we owe them the original effort to Dwight Eisenhower, who's one of the world's great planners and who understood the benefit of planning, even if you're not following the plan too long after you get it done, because there's a lot to learn and planning helps you do it. Those mechanisms simply don't exist on the domestic side. But it's ultimately up to the president whether he wants to work through the NSC structure, whether he wants to work through the coronavirus task force, which was underway for a time earlier this year, or whether he doesn't want to work through anything at all. I think there are clear benefits to interagency coordination regardless. Some presidents, including the current one, don't necessarily agree with that.
General Jones or Mr. McFarland, do you, where's the fine line between Homeland Security and what the National Security Advisor does, and how much of a role does the National Security Advisor play in Homeland Security?
Well, in the Obama administration, we had Tom Donilon was my deputy for national security, and John Brennan was the Homeland Security advisor. And we're all located in the White House, obviously. And at the president's daily briefing, all of those interests were present, and everybody had a set role to play. It was my job to kind of coordinate how that meeting went, so to make the best use of the president's time. But that seemed to, as a structure, that seemed to be a valid way and in consonance with how President Obama liked to make decisions, which was very much from the bottom up instead of from the top down.
But it was part of the National Security Council structure, was it not, until the Trump administration came around, and I believe you, Ambassador Bolton, kind of modified that structure.
Well, maybe I'll just say a quick word there. The national security and homeland security are fundamentally the same thing. I mean, I think we're talking about the same homeland. So the notion of these being separate functions, I understand, and was part of the Bush 43 administration when the separate Homeland Security Department was set up and so on. But I think ultimately you need to bring it back into a more coherent approach, which is what I tried to do. I would make other structural changes in the government beyond the NSC in that regard, but that's beyond the scope of our discussion here, I think.
Okay, well, I want to switch to sort of a broader topic and get into some of the larger threats that are facing the United States right now, kind of away from the structure of the NSC. Let's talk about asymmetric threats. And Mr. McFarland, I'm definitely going to start with you on this one. We're talking about a number of threats these days, like cyber and disinformation, biological weapons, redefining national security and defense, and particularly in the wake of COVID and, with the elections past and present. So if the homeland is no longer a sanctuary, how do U.S. national security professionals explore security issues at the nexus of forward defense and homeland security? And so, Mr. McFarland, I'll start with you on that one. If you could talk a little bit about these asymmetric threats and how to confront them.
Vivian, today it has become apparent, I think, to all of us that the foremost family of threats to the United States stem from China and the challenges it is offering in every domain, from cyber to conventional military to a kind of a novel approach to expanding China's influence through penetrating country after country by apparently benign offers to build things for the host country, whether it's Congo or the United Kingdom. That is, we will come, China, and we will build in London or Congo a power plant or a highway or a port. In short, the appearance of innocent offerings. Before how long, however, it quickly turns into an issue of indebtedness by the host country, where they borrow from China the money to build the port, let's say, in Sri Lanka. And before long, if they cannot service the debt, China generously offers to turn it into equity or ownership. So you can see how it doesn't take very long before gradually China becomes the owner of the port or the highway or the power plant, and pretty soon you have penetrated the government, China has, and begins to have enormous influence over that government's policies. Well, that has happened in more than 60 countries. China's goal in all this is to, of course, expand its influence and presence, indeed virtually to co-opt the sovereignty of country after country, for three reasons: to gain resources like cobalt in Congo or lithium in Chile. Secondly, key locations such as Suez Canal, Djibouti, Bab el-Mandeb Straits, Malacca, Gibraltar, strategic locations that enable them to function in the event of conflict and to project their forces with confidence on sea, on land, throughout the world as a crisis may require. Well, that's a gradual but very effective way to establish your presence and your ability to operate in peace and war very effectively. And of course, the last goal of those three is to penetrate markets, to assure that, in China's case, the Belt and Road Initiative enables them to get into the huge market of Western Europe and to go with competence, control over the institutions as well as the infrastructure.
General Jones and Ambassador Bolton, certainly China has raised concern now, especially, but in the past. But they're not the only ones. Other countries as well as even lone wolf actors and things like that. Can you elaborate a little bit?
John, after you.
Thank you. I think Bud's description of China was wonderful. I'm not even going to try and add to it. But I'd say at the strategic level, we have two basic threats. One is Russia, the other is China. I think the Russian threat represents the Putin regime playing a bad hand very well, especially in the past several years, and it's a good example of how even a declining economic power like Russia can use asymmetric warfare techniques, like in cyberspace in particular, and to press its advantage with the resource it does have, oil and natural gas, in the space of the former Soviet Union, in Western Europe, in the Middle East, and respecting us. And I think these two broad strategic threats are going to be critical for the next administration. I think China is the existential threat of the 21st century. But even though those are important and significant at the strategic level, I don't think you can dismiss the more immediate threats, the threats of nuclear proliferation from North Korea and Iran, which continue to grow worse, and the continuing threat of terrorism. I think the problem the U.S. faces is that we are seeing threats across a broad spectrum, which requires a broad spectrum of capabilities and response. And I just say one thing I just think is going to be critical over the next 4 years, whomever is president. This is not a time to be reducing the Defense Department budget. We need to expand our capabilities in light of this broad range of threats that we're facing.
I mean, Ambassador Bolton actually gave me, General Jones, I was going to elaborate a little bit just based on what Ambassador Bolton just said for you, is that, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres recently said that the world is living in the shadow of nuclear catastrophe. And he pointed to deep concerns, escalation with the Trump administration and China. He pointed to rocky relationship between US and Russia. Nuclear armed India and Pakistan are feuding over Kashmir. North Korea is an issue, continues to be an issue. The Iran nuclear deal is on the rocks. And so what do you make of all of this? And what can the United States do to diffuse these increasing tensions, especially among these competing nuclear powers?
Well, I think the one thing that the U.S. has to do is send a very strong message that we are committed to remaining a nation of great influence, and we are going to do those things that are required in order to maintain that greatness, akin to our role in the 20th century. I think there's still doubt about our commitment. If you look at the Middle East, for example, and going back to the Obama administration, we towards the end of that administration, the Arab world was seriously doubting our commitment, and as a result, players like Russia and others, filled the gap. We hear talk about pulling forces back to the continental United States from overseas, in Europe in particular. That's worrisome to our friends and allies. And so I think that one of the first things that we have to do is come out with a very clear policy statement that is backed up by clear action, that we are committed. We do want to maintain our position as a global leader. We know that China is a real threat. We know that Russia is a nuisance, but nonetheless a clever one at that. We know that Iran is not going to live up to its agreements, and we know what North Korea is. And we know that the war on terror finds its way through the African continent and so on and so forth. So there's an awful lot to do, but I think the first step is to reassure our friends and allies, particularly organizations, international organizations like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, where we have redefined the fact that the defense of Europe is a valid concept after years of thinking that somehow Russia was going to choose to be inside the Euro-Atlantic arc with the resurgence of Mr. Putin. as president, we know that that's not true. And so as a result, we need to make sure that as we move our forward defense of Europe closer to the Black Sea and the Baltic states, that we do those things that are absolutely essential to reassure our friends and allies and build those relationships. We need friends and we need allies. China doesn't really have a friend or an ally. They're doing it kind of on their own, and every now and then they reach out to the Russians and so on and so forth. But we do have friends and allies built upon almost a century's worth of relationships, as going back to World War I. So this is important, I think, and we need to build those relationships up again and show by our actions that we're committed to maintaining the traditional role of the United States on the global playing field, and to restate our commitment to those values that we hold dear.
Mr. McFarland, you served as National Security Advisor during the Soviet era when the Cold War was still sort of on its last leg, but still very much happening. And given what General Jones is saying right now, we talk a lot about multilateral organizations. The Trump administration has frowned upon a lot of them, not because they don't want alliances, but because they don't like the sort of lack of give and take between allies, and so they've criticized Ambassador Bolton included in certain organizations like the United Nations and things like that, where there have been faults, and this administration has called them out. And so, as someone who served during the Soviet era, I'd love you to reflect on sort of where we are with some of those alliances now, and especially an organization like NATO, which was initially sort of envisioned as a way to confront Russian aggression in Europe.
Well, Vivian, you and Jim have made a point that is salient right now, and that is the importance of allies. We have truly taken about a 30-year holiday since the end of the Cold War, where we deluded ourselves into believing that the rest of the world would evolve toward adopting freedom and the rule of law and so forth. And it hasn't happened. And awakening only in the last 5 years or so to the reality that there are such things as ambition, the lust for power and empire that currently reposes in both Russia and China, as Jim and John have described, and trying to compete now as alone America is no longer plausible or feasible. We must have allies. We see it quite vividly in recent examples, such as China's interest in expanding its control over the telecommunications of Europe with 5G. And the United Kingdom has had the courage to stand up here about 5 months ago and say, no, we're not going to have you penetrating our communications. And immediately the next day said, well, I'll call and raise you. We're going to pull out of building a power plant for you. How do you like those apples? Well, fortunately, Secretary Pompeo had the gumption to stand up and say, Mr. Prime Minister Boris Johnson, we are with you. We will be with you tomorrow to help you replace whatever China had promised to do for you. Well, that was the right thing to say. But then when you look around at our ability to build the power plant that China refused to build, we find out that we haven't built one in 30 years, at least a nuclear power plant. So we need our allies to fill in the blanks of where the United States no longer has the capability to provide the assistance, be it military or domestic and industrial. So bringing the South Koreans, Japanese, United Kingdom, France, Canada, the Quad in East Asia, from Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and India, a partner that we have not forged a long-term historic relationship that really must be brought in to rally against this complex threat being posed by China and Russia.
Ambassador Bolton, you have always stressed the need and importance for alliances, but you've been critical of certain multilateral organizations just in terms of some of the burden sharing and other issues. Can you elaborate on that? And especially given the global context of what we're talking about and the threats that exist today.
Sure, not all international organizations are created equal. NATO is not the same as the United Nations. NATO is a common defense alliance and serves all of the interests of the members. I do think that it's important for NATO members to live up to the obligations that they freely undertook about what percentage of their GDP they're going to spend on defense. And I think it's a widely held view in the United States that everybody should bear their fair share of the burden. I don't think that goes to undercutting NATO. I think there are some people in high places today who see it as an excuse to break the alliance. That's not, I think, what most people think. And I think that looking at what the structures that we've built over a sustained period of time, they need to be strengthened because we are in a time of challenge and adversity. And this is hardly the time to say we should be withdrawing significant American forces from around the world and expecting that the oceans are going to protect us. That was a great idea in the 18th century. That's not where we are today.
Right. Very important. And I want to kind of now touch upon, speaking of the United Nations, I want to touch upon two Security Council members and a current discussion, something that's in the news right now, right? Russia and China. The Trump administration has acknowledged that it is trying to get nuclear talks with Russia off the ground and possibly doing so in a swift way that they would be able to reach some sort of an agreement that might ultimately extend the New START agreement, which expires in February. Initially, the Trump administration had insisted that it would prefer trilateral nuclear talks with China being included in those talks. China and Russia have never really been very enthusiastic about that idea. And now it seems like the administration is proceeding rather rapidly with talks with Russia alone, potentially with some concessions on warheads and other issues. And so if you can, any of you just jump in and talk to me about sort of the state of play with those two nuclear powers in particular, and this vision that the Trump administration had, President Trump in particular, about having a trilateral nuclear deal, especially given the atmosphere that we're living in today with tensions rising with both countries.
Vivian, John has the most recent experience in this, but I will simply say that the last START treaty that was signed during the Obama administration was really the highlight probably of the U.S.-Russian relations, and everything seemed to go downhill after that. But John, I defer to you, I think, on more contemporary analysis of this issue.
Well, I would just say, look, I opposed New START at the time in 2010, as 2/3 of the Republicans in the Senate did. It didn't cover tactical nuclear weapons. That issue remains open today. New technological developments like hypersonic cruise missiles, clearly really not covered adequately. No criticism of New START in 2010, but we're in 2020 now. And this issue of China, which did not really come up then, either for the advocates of New START or its opponents, I think is critical. The Chinese have basically said, well, but our forces are so small, come back when it's more appropriate, meaning after we build up to your levels, then we'll talk about arms control. I don't think we ought to buy that. I think this is a critical strategic question for the United States. It was clearly right to tell the Russians that we're not in a bipolar nuclear world anymore, and the Chinese are going to have to face up to this. So I don't think we ought to let them off easily. There are models where there are vastly disproportionate powers in play at different levels of weapons capabilities. We can look to them, but nobody should think that we're back in Cold War bilateral nuclear deals with Russia where we just let China have a free pass.
John's right about that, Vivian. I think it's fair to say that Russia has adopted the stance of sponsoring an outdated treaty that, as John said, goes back 10 years, and adopting the false metaphor that, well, what theirs is theirs and what's ours is negotiable, sounding like they're wrapping themselves in the blanket of peace that's 10 years out of date. And so John's right. We deserve to have a balance here, but Russia's diffidence here is misguided, wrong-headed, and we've got to someday bring China into this discussion because it is accelerating its military strength far quicker than even Russia.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to hit upon, partly because I'm a space junkie, and so I always try to squeeze in a question about space, but given that these countries are very much involved in the space race as well, and the dominance of the, great frontier, what are the challenges and opportunities presented by new domains of operation such as space? And how has the creation of the Space Force impacted our approach to space security and defense issues in general? Anyone?
That's a very interesting question. I think the jury is still out on that one, but why not? I mean, it's something that we're going to be competitive with the Russians and the Chinese on, for sure. I think the U.S. has signaled that it's back in terms of its emphasis on space.
Do you agree
we'll see what happens.
Priority, given everything else that's happening in the world? Do you agree that should be a priority?
I think so. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Some critics would argue that we already had a dedicated capability in the Defense Department to pay attention to space, but the creation of the Space Force, we'll have to wait and see what happens. As we now have two departments in the Pentagon that have two services. One is the Navy Department with the Navy and the Marine Corps, and now the Air Force with the Space Force as well. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. Very much dependent on the outcome of the election, I think.
Of course, yes. Anyone else? Is no one else besides me?
Well, I think a one-liner, Vivian. Hypersonic vehicles alone would justify an intense focus on how in the world are we going to cope with that. And it was the consensus among the Joint Chiefs that the Air Force alone had other priorities as well and weren't really equipped historically or in terms of technology to solve that problem right now. And so we needed a dedicated force, in my opinion. However, there are limits to how often you can create a new independent force that will inevitably be at odds for getting a bigger budget with the existing services. And so there are limits to how often you can keep creating a new Space Force or X Force. For the moment, we needed it, but let's not get on this treadmill forever.
I just say, if I got to have a quick word, I think we have to be dominant in space. I think it's a venue that will be increasingly important, and to cede the initiative to other countries is definitely not in our interest. On the other hand, I don't think we should have a separate Space Force. I think technology here in the field of aerospace, and there's a reason that word exists, I think we risk having budget competition where we don't need it. So I would have kept it together, not because I underestimate the priority, quite the contrary. I think by keeping one aerospace force, or whatever you want to call it, we actually could have remained more focused. We'll see what happens.
The budget conflict or competition is an interesting topic, but I want to hit on a couple more things while we still have time before I start taking questions. We have an election in 2 weeks and a day, but who's counting? And obviously election security has been a major issue. It was a major issue in the 2016 election. It is always a major issue, but I'm talking now, since you all served as national security advisors, from the foreign influence perspective. What more should we be doing to protect the integrity of the election from foreign interference? Let's keep it to that topic, given the roles that you've served. And, where are we falling short? I mean, I without taking this too politically, but I want also you to reflect about exactly what we can do to really protect the integrity of our elections from foreign players. Maybe we start with you, Ambassador Bolton, since you served most recently.
Look, foreign interference in our elections is an act of war against the Constitution. We shouldn't tolerate it. We should increase our offensive cyber capabilities. and we should help create structures of deterrence to say to Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, whomever, you're going to pay a much higher cost if you try and mess with our elections than you think you're going to be able to achieve. Look, this is classic authoritarian efforts to disrupt democratic societies. It's not a question of picking one candidate over another. They're trying to undermine our basic institutions, and our approach should be absolutely zero tolerance.
General Jones, if you were National Security Advisor today, what would you be doing to combat this?
Well, I agree with what John just said, but I think one of the big things that the next administration should concentrate on is repairing fractured relationships, somewhat personal relationships too, at the national leaders level that are just not in our best interest to sustain. There are some people who think that the rest of the 21st century is going to be pretty much a retrenchment back to a bipolar world. And instead of the US and the Soviet Union, it'll be US and China. And everybody in between the two is going to have to eventually pick sides. There are a lot of countries that want to have it both ways. They when you look at China and what they're doing with the concentration camps for the Muslim population, the Uyghurs, that doesn't seem to spark a lot of outrage in people in other countries who want to have economic dealings with China and pretend like that's not important. I think one of the things that's very important for the future is kind of reassess what our values are, restate our values, make sure that our closest friends and allies share those values and all that means in terms of our behavior on the global playing field. I think the 21st century is about cybersecurity, just like in the 20th century it was about nuclear power. The problem with cybersecurity is there are no regulatory framework, international regulatory frameworks that can control the spread of this technology. So people are free to use it as they see fit, and we see in our own country the results of big tech companies using their technology any way they want to, whether it's in consonance with our Constitution or not. So there's some big issues out there that are completely unregulated, and I think domestically we're going to have to do that. And I think we're going to have to be the champions of international regulation as well, because cybersecurity is in fact the wolf that's closest to the door. And I will say that happily, and although it's not well known, but happily the United States has developed the kinds of technologies that democracies will gravitate towards: secure 5G, impenetrable 5G, and available to be used on legacy systems as well. So I think we're in good position to reassume the mantle of leadership on this critical question.
Vivian, I think Jim is spot on with that. And beyond cyberspace, China has penetrated other institutions in our country with great advantage for themselves. Even the stock markets. We've had over 160 Chinese companies registered on American stock exchanges. Well, that sounds innocent enough. And yet from that opportunity, they've reaped trillions of dollars that have now gone to advancing China's strategy throughout the world. So they're really having it both ways. Education, they've penetrated our institutions of advanced scholarship in universities throughout our country, and through the Confucius institutions that are sowing Chinese doctrine of the Chinese Communist Party. These penetrations of institutions that are very precious to us, they condition the thinking of the next generation of young Americans. Well, you see where this is going. It's technology, it's both stealing it from us, also penetrating the institutions that advance it. So we've got our hands full, and we need to overcome our shortcomings. Jim's right. We have to be the leader of allies countering this Chinese onslaught.
Thank you for that. I have about a million more questions myself, but I'm going to turn it over to the audience. And I apologize in advance to all. If you see me looking down, I'm juggling gadgets. That's sort of the era we live in right now. So I'm going to try to make this work. So the first question is from Darren Hall, who's a student at the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. Darren, I'm happy you asked this question because I wanted to dig in on it a little more. How will the threat of bioterrorism and biological weapons evolve over the next 5 to 10 years? And what are the implications for new U.S. national security? Ambassador Bolton, why don't we start with you on that one?
Well, I'm afraid that the spread and the course of the coronavirus in this country this year has taught our adversaries a significant lesson about just how vulnerable we are and how badly we fumbled this particular incident. You know, the epidemiology of a biological weapons attack is really quite similar to the epidemiology of a pandemic, and at least under some scenarios. And we've not done a good job. So, it has long been the case that chemical weapons and biological weapons have been called the poor man's nuclear weapon. And I think a lot of people will look at that. And it's not just attacks on the human population, it could be an attack on our food supply as well. So I think this is clearly something that we need to learn and prepare for better in the future. I think it's also told us something about China and the way they behave. I think there are significant reasons to believe that we still don't know but a small part of what actually happened with this disease in China, its spread and its effect. And I think it's clear that China's handling of it has adversely affected opinions about China quite justifiably all around the world. But in terms of the priority, I don't know what else you need other than this ongoing tragedy to see that biodefense needs more attention.
Completely agree.
And a thumbs up from Mr. McFarland. Okay, we're going to move on. This is a good one. Jeremy Newman asks, how do we tackle security risks of climate change beyond polarizing rhetoric? And how do we turn these risks into action over the long term? Mr. McFarland, do you want to talk about it? Yep, go for it. Just jump in, gentlemen.
Well, Vivian, there are several things we must do. The basic issue is how do we stop encouraging the emission of carbon in our transportation systems, as well as our power generation and so forth. And we have to begin to examine what are the alternatives. So electricity is so fundamental, we need to examine, well, how do you get it? Most of our electricity has come from coal for the past 100 years. And we're finding, however, that coal puts out a lot of carbon. Well, what else? Natural gas, oil, renewables like wind and solar. Yes, that makes sense, the latter. However, you find out that solar and wind are limited in their ability to provide base load power, that is, to be available all the time and large enough to be able to power industries as well as power generation and recharging new electric vehicles. Well, it leading us, or should lead us back to a way of generating electricity that is well known to us. Although we haven't built a nuclear power plant in 30 years, we ought to begin to start again because it's the only source of power that is available 24/7 and doesn't emit anything. Wind and solar are good as far as they go. Today, however, the blessing is that there are American companies as well as British, Polish, and several others who are exploring a different kind of power plant. It's called small modular power generation. Bill Gates at Terra Power, NewScale, others in in Great Britain, Rolls-Royce, for example, Synthos in Poland. So these new, small, adaptable ways of generating power are coming online, we can overcome the carbon issue. It's going to take policy changes, mostly in Europe, who have said we don't want nuclear, and suddenly they're awakening to the fact that, well, it's the only way to get from here to achieving the Paris Accord standards that were set for limiting growth and temperature in the years ahead. Thank you.
I would just piggyback on that a little bit by saying that without question, one of the greatest things that's happened to the United States has happened recently, and that's its global position with regard to becoming an energy have instead of an energy have not, particularly where oil and gas are concerned. I think that's a tremendous technological achievement that has really placed the United States in a position of great leadership globally on energy issues. I'm old enough to remember the early days of the 70s where I would get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to line up at the gas station to get a couple of gallons of gas in my Volkswagen so I could get to the amphibious warfare school at Quantico. And we look at where we are today. So this was something that we should celebrate, and we should invest, I think, or vest in the Secretary of Energy the responsibility for managing the entire spectrum of our energy good fortune, not just one or two particular aspects of the energy portfolio. But until recently, the EPA made more energy policy than the Department of Energy ever proposed. And I'm very happy and very proud to see that we've somewhat turned that corner in the Energy Department. Is not the Department of Nuclear Energy alone, but the Department of the total energy assets of the United States. That's very important.
True.
Great.
But let me just add, if I could, one point on the international aspect of this. You know, there's a lot of rhetoric about how international agreements are somehow going to affect climate change, but there has not been one climate agreement to date, including the Paris Accords, that really do anything in terms of verification and enforcement. And there's a lot of political rhetoric out there from a lot of places, including our friends in Europe, but particularly coming from China and India, about what they're going to do. And yet, if you look at the real sources of continuing sources of this problem, it remains countries that make promises and don't fulfill them. So until there's something more involved in how these agreements are going to be made workable, I think we could do with less rhetoric and more thinking about that question, frankly.
Spot on, John. That's right. A lot of arm waving by China and Russia, and yet China remains the biggest emitter of carbon in the world by many multiples. So,
well, let me be devil's advocate here and ask, with the Paris Climate Accord or with the Iran nuclear deal or any of these agreements, a lot of folks argue that you get the framework in place and improve it over time versus not having one at all, which, then everyone is just willy-nilly kind of doing their own thing. And so what do you say to people who say get a framework in place and improve upon it, like the climate accord, like the Iran nuclear deal? I mean, they're very different issues, but I'm trying to get to the core issue of start with something and then build on it.
Yeah. Well, it goes to the question whether the country that you're trying to affect, whether it's Iran and its nuclear program or China and its carbon emissions, are put in a stronger or a weaker position by the underlying agreement. And I would say, obviously, it depends on the particular circumstances, but our experiences were so eager to have a deal, so eager to say we've made progress, that you leave the target really in a better position after the agreement than before. And then you've got the problem of how you change the relative positions. So again, I think this is more a rhetorical issue in many cases than it is a hard-eyed examination of the realities, whether it's climate change or nuclear proliferation.
Okay. I'm going to jump. I want to get a couple more questions in. We have just about 10 minutes left. John Dermody, who's a former NSC deputy legal advisor, asks a question: what should the long-term strategy be to address security concerns of foreign technology? And is it sufficient to simply block these technologies or to take punitive actions? Any of you jump in, please, if you have thoughts.
Well, I think just say quickly. I think we should do more than block them. I think there are a lot of things, and again, China is the issue here that I think Bud and Jim would agree with. They're the biggest stealers of our intellectual property by any measure of magnitude around the world. So it's really, in some cases, not foreign technology we're faced with, but things that China and others have stolen from us. And I think there are a whole range of steps we haven't taken yet that would show just how serious we can be, that would prevent China from not just from stealing it, but from profiting from it.
I mean, but 5G is an issue. It's not only that. The Chinese are also advancing on certain other issues.
No, but Bud raised this earlier, and it's a very good point. The Chinese, through a complex financial mechanism of subsidies and advantageous financial terms, at least in the first instance, get Huawei in a position where it gets involved in telecommunication systems, and then it's in a better position going forward. All of this has to do with the Chinese approach, not just in the political and intelligence gathering mode, but in the economic sphere as well. And we've got to do better at combating it.
From my standpoint, I think China has decided on two things. One is, I think China has really stolen our playbook from the 20th century and is adapting it to the 21st century, studying very hard how the United States came from where it was in the earlier part of the 20th century to a position of absolute preeminence by the end of the century. So I think they've studied that playbook a little bit. But what they've adapted, I think, is a kind of a three-step strategy that originally hinges on penetration of markets. And they have a very seductive way of doing that, very appealing, very non-threatening, economically viable. They obviously pay bribes to anybody that'll take bribes, et cetera. They come to the meetings with a bag of cash. And once they've achieved that penetration, they expand on it. Generally, when they get contracts, they bring in their own labor force. They even brought in Algeria, they even brought prison ships with Chinese prisoners to do the work. So they don't use local work, and they don't share their technology. They build it, they let them use it, but they maintain it. And then the third step is to use that dependence that they built to manipulate the government of a particular country. One of our closest allies in South Korea is now, their economy is now almost 30% dependent on China. And China is lecturing the South Koreans, our closest ally, on what it is they want them to do in relation to the security agreements with the United States and military exercises and so on and so forth. And if they don't, they threaten overtly economic reprisals on almost 30% of their economy. And there are Korean companies, for example, that have no relation with the United States but are wholly dependent on their relation with China. And in a democracy, they argue for going soft on China in one of our closest allies. So it's very ingenious, it's very subtle, but it has devastating long-term consequences, and we have to be able to offset that.
Thank you.
Jim's exactly right about that. It is not just South Korea. When you look at what China has done, it now owns 60% of Congo's cobalt, a critical commodity for high-tech technology and applications. Similarly, in Chile, with lithium being the goal there. Separately, I mentioned earlier their penetration of our stock markets and the $1 trillion they've reaped from American investors who end up funding China's ability to expand its influence throughout the world. And more than 100 companies already, countries.
Thank you for that. Oh my goodness, there's so many great questions here, but we have only about 5 minutes left, and I do want to get some closing remarks from all of you. So I'm gonna ask you about the implications. Lauren Toms from the Washington Times asks, what will the implications of a significant U.S. troop withdrawal from Afghanistan by Christmas have on the stability of the Afghan Taliban peace talks and U.S. presence in the region in general? I'd love to hear you all reflect on that plan. Ambassador Bolton, since you've been
Go ahead, John.
Well, I think it would be a huge mistake. I think the advantage of keeping a substantial American force, not only for counterterrorism purposes, but for others in Afghanistan, should be clear by now, although obviously it isn't. It's not that we're eager to have wars go on forever. We don't get to decide that alone, however. And it's the question should be, what is in America's best national security interest? If having forces deployed abroad provides the greater potential to protect a homeland and our allies against attacks, whether it's from terrorists or from more conventional enemies, then it's in our interest to do it. And that's the calculus we should apply. The answer will change over time, but this kind of reflexive knee-jerk assumption that if we bring the forces home that we'll be in better shape internationally, I just think has been proven wrong so many times in history, it gets frustrating to hear it again.
One of my favorite sayings is virtual presence is actual absence. And if you're absent, you're going to create vacuums, and vacuums will be filled by people that don't have your best interests at heart. I think the tragedy of Afghanistan and Iraq, in a sense, was that in our haste to put up a government, following our military victory, we were too hasty and too accepting of whoever emerged as a leader in the case of Karzai and Prime Minister Maliki. And we didn't spend enough time making sure that the government was in fact capable and legitimate, and pay a lot of attention to economic revival and reform. I mean, when you go into a country and you advertise that we are not going to do nation building, then the whole premise of how we succeed in World War II is called into question. And I think that's a big mistake.
I think he's right. Jim has been there and done that and understands what we have to achieve in Afghanistan. Bottom line, however, it seems to me, is that to put our trust in the Taliban in an agreement that doesn't enable us to assure against a revanchist takeover by the Taliban in the months, years ahead is misguided. I think, to go back to your point, Vivian, of allies, today there is a meeting of an alliance taking place in Eastern Europe, and it's called the Three Seas Initiatives. And it's all those countries who have lived for 50 years under the boot of the Soviet Union. It's called the Three Seas Initiative, and they're talking about how they can cooperate in making sure that each of them doesn't fall prey to pressures from China or Russia, more likely, to building fundamental things like electricity and power plants. That's exactly the kind of rebuilding of alliances that we need to focus on in the months and years ahead. And got a big mountain to climb in that domain.
Right. 30 seconds left, basically, 30 seconds for each of you left to talk just about closing remarks. Tell us what is keeping you up at night moving forward. Maybe we start with you, Mr. McFarland, and kind of go chronologically.
Well, this isn't what keeps me up at night, but it's what I think is important. And I'll go back to President Eisenhower's farewell address, and it'll just take 10 seconds to read. He said, "America is today the most influential and the most productive nation in the world." But he continued, "Understand and be proud of this preeminence. we yet realize that America's leadership and prestige depend on how we use our power in the interest of world peace and human betterment. And then he added, throughout America's adventure in government, our basic purposes have been to keep the peace, to foster progress in human achievement, and to enhance liberty, dignity, and integrity among peoples and among nations. And then he warned, any failure traceable to arrogance or a lack of compassion or readiness to sacrifice would inflict upon us grievous hurt, both at home and abroad.
Poignant words. Thank you, McFarland. 20 seconds, just what keeps you up at night? What are your final thoughts?
The combined cooperative effort by Russia and China to penetrate our countries and those of Africa, Latin America, and Europe is the central threat we must face. And it's in every domain: military, economic, technology, education, healthcare, as we are currently seeing. We have to get better at how we defend against the entire spectrum of the instruments of their expansion, notably cyber, but these subtle offers of encumbering countries all over the world to enormous debt that they can never service, but collapse under the influence and control of China. We can do it, but we need allies to do it, and leadership, leadership, leadership.
Thank you, sir. Ambassador Bolton, final word.
Look, both parties have pronounced tendencies to say, let's just focus on domestic issues. Let's forget about all this stuff internationally. And the fact is, we can't have a strong position in the world as a whole unless we have a strong economy at home and a strong society. But make no mistake, without a strong American presence around the world, we will not have a strong society and a strong economy here, period.
Very interesting discussion. Thank you, gentlemen, so much for joining me today. It was really fascinating. And thank you all who are out there. I'm sorry we didn't get to see you, but I'm glad that we got to talk virtually. And thanks to the Atlantic Council for hosting this fantastic and important and timely event. It's been a pleasure. Everyone have a great day. Stay safe out there.
Thank you, Vivian.
Thank you.
Thank you.